Good morning. Good to see you all. So this week's Parsha is called Vayera, which means "and he appeared." And it begins right after the end of last week's Parsha when Abraham was 99 years old. Hashem had told him to circumcise himself, which he did. And following that, this week's Parsha opens where Hashem appears to Abraham right after he circumcised himself. And our sages say to visit the sick, which itself is an important mitzvah. And maybe we should do another class. They're not here to write down the class, but maybe we should do another class on the mitzvah of visiting the sick. Very important mitzvah. And then the Torah tells us how Abraham sees three men. He doesn't know at the time that they are angels, and he invites them in. He takes good care of them, and then one of the men announced that Sarah is going to have a child next year at this time. And Sarah laughs because she is 89 years old. Her husband is 99 years old. They're a little bit too old. And Hashem turns to Abraham and says, nothing is impossible for Hashem. And so the angels then move on their way, and they head towards the city of Sodom, where Abraham's nephew Lot lived. The people of Sodom were very, very wicked. And Hashem was intended to destroy the city of Sodom and its four nearby towns. The Torah doesn't give us the details of exactly why they were wicked. However, in the books of our prophets, we are told that they were wicked because they did not believe in hospitality and they did not believe in helping others in need. In the words of the Mishnah, they said, what is mine, what is yours, each person for themselves. Nobody should be helping anybody else. It was illegal to help other people or to be hospitable and bring in strangers into your home. And so, and there were severe punishments for doing so. The Midrash tells us in detail. And so because of that, Hashem felt that such a city needs to be destroyed. It cannot survive. And although they were very wealthy, but they were not hospitable at all or generous at all, they didn't believe in helping other people. And so Hashem first tells Abraham that he's planning to destroy the city of Sodom. Abraham begins to plead with Hashem not to. He first says, perhaps there are 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom. Will you save the city because of them? And Hashem says, there are no 50 righteous people in Sodom. Abraham suggests maybe there are 40. Hashem says there are no 40 righteous people. Maybe 30. There aren't even 30. Maybe 20. There aren't even 20. And Abraham says maybe there are 10 righteous people in Sodom. Save the whole city because of them. And Hashem says there aren't even 10 righteous people in Sodom. And so Abraham gives up. The angels, meanwhile, head off to Sodom. Over there, at the entrance of the city, they meet Abraham's nephew Lot. Like his uncle Abraham, Lot is very hospitable. He invites the guests to come spend the night at his house. However, he warns them, you got to come in a way that nobody sees you, because if anyone sees you entering my house, we get into big trouble. It's very dangerous. And so they come to his house, and he makes matzah for them. They eat. Takes care of them, and then before they go to sleep, the rumor had already spread that Lot had guests in his home, and so the entire city gathered outside Lot's home, from old to young, and they were calling on Lot to come to bring out. So Lot goes out to them, and they tell Lot to let the guests out, because they want to rape them. That's presumably where the term sodomites comes from. And that was their punishment to these guests for daring to take hospitality. Lot refuses, and the guests grab him back in. They smite the people with, they're angels after all, they smite the people with blindness, and then they tell Lot, we're about to destroy the city, and but we're taking you out. Go call your married children, your married daughters, your sons-in-law, and tell them to come with you. And Lot goes to his sons-in-law. They refuse to come, so he has no choice. He has to leave them behind. It's just his wife and his two daughters. They start packing up. It's taking too long. The angels say, hurry, don't take anything with you. We just have to run. They run outside the city, and over there, the angel tells them, do not turn around. Do not look at what's happening behind you. Just run to the mountains. Lot says, I don't want to go to the mountains, meaning near Abraham. He was afraid to be near Abraham. And so he asks Hashem to spare one of the 5 nearby cities, the city of Tzoar, the smallest of the 5. And Hashem agrees to his request. And Hashem spares the city. And then Lot and his wife and daughters run. Lot's wife turns around to see what is happening behind her, and she turns into a pillar of salt. And so now it's only Lot and his 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the city of Sodom is Hashem rains down sulfur, fire and brimstone and fiery stone down on the city, and the city is entire turns them over the city, and the cities are entirely destroyed. And then Abraham gets up the next morning and he sees over Sodom. He looks out over Sodom and he sees just a big pillar of smoke coming up from where Sodom had been. It's now destroyed. Lot and his daughters, meanwhile, leave the city of Tzoar. They're afraid it's too close to the city of Sodom. They go to the mountains where they live in a cave. Over there in a cave, they happen to find wine there. And Lot's daughters think that they are the only surviving humans left. And so they agree to give their father the wine, and they will then have relations with their father while he is drunk in order to be able to produce offspring, in order to keep humanity alive. When they do so, each of them become pregnant from their father. They have children. One has a child who they call Moab, who's the father of the nation of Moab. One is a child who she calls Ben Ami, who is the father of the nation of Ammon. And these nations are then descendants of Lot. Abraham, meanwhile, moves away from Hebron and where he had lived. He moves to Philistine land, to Gerar, which is where the Philistines lived in southwest Israel. Over there, the king of the Philistines, Avimelech, sees Sarah's beauty, and even though she's now 99 years old, and he kidnaps her, but Hashem smites the city, Avimelech and his family. Because of this, they are all punished, they're all stricken, and Avimelech lets Sarah go. I forgot to mention, Abraham told Sarah again to say that she is my sister, that I am his sister. Then they settled there in Philistine. Land. Now, finally, a year later, a year after the visit of the angels, Sarah becomes pregnant, and a year later she has a son. They call his name Yitzchak, as Hashem had instructed. They circumcise him on the 8th day after he was born. They make a big party for him when he reaches maturity, perhaps the first bar mitzvah. And then Sarah notices that Yishmael, who is 14 years older than Yitzchak, is being a bad influence on Yitzchak. And so she turns to Abraham and she tells Abraham to drive her son Ishmael away. Abraham does not want to, but Hashem tells him to listen to his wife Sarah. And so he sends Ishmael and Hagar away. They go into the desert. They run out of water in the desert. Over there, Ishmael is going to die of thirst. And Hagar puts him under a bush, not to see him die. And she turns to Hashem and she prays, and Hashem listens. She sees an angel who tells her, don't be afraid, Hashem has heard your prayer. She opens her eyes and she sees right in front of her is a well of water. She feeds her child water, she gives him to drink, and they stay in the desert. He becomes a bandit, as Hashem had originally predicted, that he would be a wild man attacking people, and he marries a woman from Egypt. Then the Torah fast forwards many years. Isaac is already grown up, and Hashem now tells. Before that, the Philistines, Avimelech, comes to Abraham and decides to make a covenant with Abraham because Hashem had protected him, seeing that Hashem is with him, and they make a covenant together. Abraham notes that Avimelech, the Philistine shepherds, had stolen his wells that he had dug. for which Avimelech says he never knew about it, but he will do something about it, and they make a covenant over there. And then fast forward many years, Hashem tells Abraham to take his son Isaac and sacrifice him on a mountain that he will show him, on Mount Moriah. And Abraham takes Isaac. Isaac doesn't ask any questions. They go to the mountain, and over there, Abraham built an altar and ties down Isaac, ready to slaughter him. And he's about to slaughter him with the knife, and then Hashem appears to him and says, do not slaughter him, don't do anything to him. I just wanted to test you to see if you will listen to me. And I will give you great blessings. And Abraham then sees a sheep in the bushes, and he takes the sheep and slaughters the sheep as a sacrifice instead. And so that is, and we once did a class where we spoke about the Akedah, this particular incident of the binding of Isaac in great detail. So that's the parsha in short. Let me open it now to a few questions, and then we will get to our topic for today. Any questions? Yes, Deb. Why does Hashem like animal slaughter for sacrifices? That is an excellent question. We've done twice address that question. I think it's the only subject that we've done twice, and I encourage you to listen to the podcast where we address exactly that question. Very good question. Susan.
Not a question, but a comment.
Sure.
What you just told us is like a soap opera. It's like a really nasty soap opera. And I'm surprised that God doesn't see how flawed man is that he created. And that there's never been any adjustments made.
You're concerned that man is very flawed. You're absolutely right. Man is very flawed, or humans are very flawed. And that was part of the plan. We were supposed to be flawed, and we're supposed to succeed despite our flaws. If you make it too easy for us, then it'd be no fun.
Like for who? Yeah, no, exactly.
Well, maybe I misused the word fun. It would be of no value if it was really easy.
No pain, no gain.
Don't you pay good from the Father?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So that's what happened in those.
Well, they meant well because they thought that nobody else there was. They thought that they were the only humans left, and they were trying to keep humanity alive. It was well-meaning. It wasn't a good idea, but it was still well-meaning. It becomes, and not to get into it now, the story of Ammon and Moab are really important because.
That happens today, though. It's the same thing, but it happens today.
Please. Debbie. The story of Ammon and Moab is important without getting into the details. Firstly, those are two nations that are going to live near Israel later. Hashem is going to later ban us from marrying into the nations of Ammon and Moab, marrying men from the nations of Ammon and Moab, and perhaps their origins is part of the reason. But interestingly, women from Ammon and Moab who convert to Judaism are allowed to marry Jews. And some very prominent women converted over the years from Ammon and Moab. And most importantly, the royal house of David are descendants of Ruth, who was a Moabite, and descendants of Naamah, the wife of King Solomon, who was a Ammonite. So we have, so the royal house of David are descendants of both Moabites and Ammonites. And so this was kind of the source of the house of David, and why the house of David comes from these stories is perhaps a subject of its own that we can talk about one day. All right, with that, let's get to our topic for today. So because the parsha opens with the story of Abraham's hospitality, therefore I felt it very appropriate to address a topic that we surprisingly have not yet addressed, which is Jewish hospitality. The Torah tells us in this week's parsha how Hashem appeared to Abraham as Abraham was sitting in front of his tent. And Abraham sees these three guests, the three men standing in front of him. He interrupts his conversation with Hashem and he goes to greet his guests. And he addressed his guests with great respect, calling them by masters. And he invites them in. He offers them to rest, to eat, to drink. He's going to care for them. The Torah tells us that he even slaughtered a calf on their behalf in order to give them good meat. Rashi tells us he didn't slaughter one calf, but he slaughtered 3 calves in order to give each one tongue, which is the best meat you can give. And he made food for them. He then serves them by himself. We learn from Abraham the great mitzvah of Hachnasat Orchim, inviting guests or hospitality. So now the mitzvah of Hachnasat Orchim, inviting guests, is not one of our 613 commandments. We have 613 commandments. The Torah does not say anywhere, you shall invite guests. It's not one of the 613. However, our sages list a number of subcategories of the mitzvah of Va'avta l'reacha kamocha. You shall love your fellow as yourself, which is one of the 613. And there are a number of, well, how do you love your fellow as yourself? Our sages list a number of particular things that people should do in order to love their fellow as themselves that are demonstrated in the Torah as ideal things to do. And one of those is bringing in guests, inviting in guests. So it is a mitzvah, but a subcategory of the mitzvah of loving your fellow as yourself. Now, from the Torah's lengthy, detailed description of Abraham's hospitality, that shows us how important hospitality is, how important it is to invite in guests. First, and we learn many rules about inviting in guests from the details the Torah describes about Abraham's hospitality. Firstly, our sages say that hospitality is more important than conversing with Hashem. And that's evidenced by the fact that Abraham was in the middle of a conversation with Hashem, and he asked Hashem to please wait while he takes care of his guests. So you see, taking care of guests is more important than talking to Hashem. We would do anything for Hashem to talk to us. So we should do even more. We should do anything to be hospitable. It's more important. We also learn from Abraham how to treat our guests. For one, he treats them with great respect. He calls them my masters. He calls himself your servant. Speaks to them which would have been a respectful way to speak to people then. We don't speak to people like that today. But he treated them with great respect. So it's important that we treat our guests with great respect. We also must give them the best of what we have. Just as Abraham gave the choicest, the best, slaughtering calves for his guests in order to give them the best food he could. We also learn that we should serve the guests ourselves. Even if you have servants or people in the home that can serve your guests, we should serve the guests ourselves as Abraham himself. Although we know he was very wealthy and he had many servants, he served the guests by himself. It is also important, another interesting thing we learn from Abraham is that he gave his child, he had one child at the time, Ishmael, he gave his child the role of preparing the meat. And we learn from here that not only should you yourself serve the guests, if you have children at home, you should give your children also the opportunity of serving the guests to train them in this very important mitzvah. It is also important that we be happy when we have guests. Not just invite guests begrudgingly because we have no choice. Sometimes even if the guest perhaps isn't entirely respectful as we would like, or perhaps doesn't act as politely as we would like, we still should treat our guests warmly, positively, respectfully. In fact, our sages say that while charity, it's also important to give charity with the right countenance, with the right face, right? To do it warmly. But if you didn't do it warmly, at least they got the money. With inviting guests, our sages say, the one's disposition, the way one acts to them, is more important than the actual invite. because you'd prefer not to be invited to someone's home if they're not going to treat you properly. And so for inviting guests, it's more important how they talk to you and how the host talks and how the host treats the guest than inviting the guest itself. The Midrash tells us King Solomon lost his kingdom at one point, and it's a fascinating story that we addressed when we did a class on King Solomon. But at one point he lost his kingdom and he was banished far away, and he was wandering around the countryside, penniless. One day, a wealthy man invited him to his home for dinner, and he served him the very best foods. And then the wealthy man said, "You used to be King Solomon." And he started reminding him of the wonderful foods he had and the wonderful comforts that he had as the king, and how he's now lost it all. Look at you now. You have nothing. And of course, the king felt very sad, being reminded about his once greatness and now how he's suffering. He felt very, very sad and was not happy, even though he had great food and he had a very good meal. He still was not happy. The next day, a poor man invited him. The poor man did not have a lot of good food to give him. The poor man gave him the bare food, the simple food that he had. However, the poor man reassured him, "Don't worry about your plight. You will one day return and become King Solomon once again." And he left the poor man's home. Although his stomach was not as full and he had not eaten as good food, he left feeling really, really good. And he then wrote in the book of Proverbs, he said, "Toiv aruchat yarak mishor avos." A meal of vegetables is better than a fattened cow. A vegetable meal with warmth and care and concern is better, more valuable to a guest than a fancy meal where you are degraded or put down. So it's important when inviting guests, not just how you treat, what you give to the guests, but also how you speak to them and how you treat them and how warmly you invite them in. In addition to the mitzvah of bringing guests into our home and caring for them, our sages say we also have to accompany them on their way. Now, this primary rule was when people lived in small towns. You should accompany them to show them the correct route to their next stop, that you don't want them to go the wrong way and end up in danger. In fact, our sages say if they do go the wrong way and end up in danger, the host is at fault for not accompanying them on their way. But the truth is, even today, when everyone has Google Maps and there is no longer a concern that they will go the wrong way, we're also not living at the edge of town. They're going to get lost walking along country roads. However, anyway, they likely have a car. However, we should still accompany our guests to the door. And even out of the door, we should go at least almost 4 cubits, which is about 6 feet, walk them outside the door. So don't just, when your guests say, "Thank you very much for having me," say goodbye, "Thank you for coming," and wave them out. But you actually, we should walk our guests to the door and even walk them out the door. Why? Because if you say goodbye, and you're just sitting there, it sounds like you are happy for them to leave. You're not showing concern for them even as they're leaving. But if you take this effort to get up and walk them to the door, it shows even as they're leaving, you're concerned for them. You still care for them. You walk them out the door as they're leaving your home. It shows an extra concern and care. And therefore, our sages say there's an extra mitzvah in inviting guests, that's called mitzvah leviyah, the mitzvah of accompanying. And our sages say, schar leviyah, keneged kulam, that one gets more reward for accompanying your guests outside than for bringing the guests in. So it's very important when you invite guests to accompany them outside. So because of this important mitzvah, because of this important mitzvah, first done by our forefather Abraham, but then repeated by many, many other individuals, both in Tanakh, in our scriptures. We have many people who invite guests and invite guests in warmly throughout the book of Tanakh, then throughout our history. It has always been a very Jewish thing. We have always been very hospitable, both to people we know as well as to people we don't know. But it is more than that. Like charity. Charity has two parts to it, and we discussed this when we did our class on charity. We all have an obligation to be charitable to somebody in need. But we also recognize that very few individuals, perhaps no individuals, can care for everybody in need. So we also have a collective communal responsibility to care for everyone in need. So there's a kind of two-sided responsibility. There's a personal responsibility to help each person in need to the best of our ability. And then there's a communal responsibility to ensure that everyone is cared for. And the same is also with inviting guests. We cannot possibly invite everybody into our home, but we certainly should try to invite as much as we can, whoever we can, have an open home. But also there is a communal responsibility to ensure that everyone that needs a place to stay or a place to eat has a place to stay and a place to eat. So every community had a responsibility to ensure that all poor guests passing through, who perhaps could not afford to stay in a local hotel, or in towns, smaller towns where they didn't even have hotels. So there's a communal responsibility that everyone passing through town should have a place to stay and food to eat. This is, of course, in a time before they had websites that you could just go on and book the hotel and book your entire itinerary, right? Back then, before you came into the town, you didn't know where you would stay in the town. And if you were traveling a long distance, you would have to make many, many stops on your journey, right? You couldn't fly across the world in 15 hours like you can today. But you would travel slowly and you would make many stops. Each place you need a place to stay. The wealthy, or in larger towns, would stay in inns or hotels. But in smaller towns, villages did not have places for people to stay. You would stay in people's homes. You would ask someone to invite you. The poor, especially even in larger towns, did not have money to pay for hotels. They often went by foot from town to town and traveled by foot and did not really have money for lodging or food. So every Jewish community in the old country had a shelter that was called the Hekdesh in Yiddish, where poor guests would be able to stay. So as a shelter, where anyone passing through town would be able to stop there as necessary and stay over there in this shelter. Every Jewish community also had a soup kitchen, both for the local poor as well as for poor guests passing through. Anyone who needed a hot meal was able to stop by the soup kitchen and get a hot meal. So we Jews have been both hospitable in person, in other words, personally hospitable, having an open home, inviting people in need for a place to sleep, food to eat, and caring for them, as well as communally as a community, ensuring that we had places that the community supported where anyone can stay, as well as places to a place where anyone can stay, as well as places where people can eat. Yes.
Is there an organization in LA that if you don't have a Shabbos meal, that they will deliver it to your house?
I don't know. I don't know. It could be. I don't know. But many communities do have organizations that will help people find meals, find places to stay. Now, some of this has changed nowadays, and I'm going to soon talk about why things might be a little bit different nowadays. We'll talk about that soon. So the Midrash tells us that Job, had many, many guests. So many guests that or he was so open to having guests that he had doors on all sides of his house to make it easier for guests to come in. Abraham, the Medrash says, was even greater. He didn't have doors on all sides of his house so that guests could come in. Abraham went outside looking for guests. The Medrash continues. He built a big building on the crossroads to put out food and drink, and he would stand outside and encourage travelers to come in and to rest. Our sages say so much so that 3 days after his circumcision, when Hashem visited him at the beginning of this week's Parsha, Hashem made it very, very hot because he knew Abraham spent a lot of time caring for guests. But he was sick after the circumcision. Hashem did not want him to have to worry about guests, so he made it very, very hot so nobody would be outside and traveling. However, Abraham still went outside looking for guests and was sad and that nobody was coming. And it was at this point that Hashem sent him the angels, seeing that he wanted the guests so badly. And so it's not enough, we learn from Abraham, it's not enough just to have an open home when someone asks, but to be proactive and proactively seek out guests and seek people in need and invite people into your home. In fact, the Medrash tells us that Abraham was so generous that Midat HaChesed, the attribute of kindness, the power of kindness on earth, turned to Hashem and said, there's no need for me anymore. You have Abraham. He was so kind and so generous. So this mitzvah of having guests brings great, great reward to a person who has guests. And anyone who has guests, our sages speak of the wonderful goodness that will come to them as a result of being generous and hospitable. But particularly, we see repeatedly that having guests brings one to having children, and particularly to having joy from one's children. We know when the angels came to Abraham and Sarah at this time had no children, and they left with a promise that they would have a child. And indeed, a year later, they do have children. But we find further, Laban, Jacob's father-in-law, has 2 daughters, and he was okay, it appears, but not a wealthy man. Jacob comes to visit him. He invites Jacob in. He didn't treat him the best, but he invited him in. And we're told that during the time Jacob was there, he had many more children. His daughters married Jacob, and he had many grandchildren. And he also, during this time, became very wealthy, all because he invited in guests. Later, Moses visits Jethro, and Jethro at the time has 7 daughters, but no sons. And after he invited Moshe into his home, Moshe marries one of his daughters, Tzipporah. They have children. Jethro has more children himself, and Jethro himself also becomes very wealthy as a result. Later in this week's Haftorah, we tell the story of the Shunammite woman who hosted Elisha, the prophet Elisha. And then Elisha blesses her. She had no children at the time. Elisha blesses her with a child. So from this, our sages say that we see that inviting guests leads to the blessing of having children and leads to bring blessings to the children or grandchildren that one already has through inviting guests. One such story is told about the parents of the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. His parents' names were Eliezer and Sarah, and they had been married for many years without children. They excelled in hospitality, always opening their home to people in need. One Friday night, after Shabbat services had ended, somebody, a Jewish traveler, walks into shul carrying his bag. Now we know that on Shabbat, you're not allowed to carry in a public area. The people in the shul are really upset. How can a Jew walk in desecrating the Shabbat? This was at a time when it was unheard of for any Jew to desecrate the Shabbat. But Rabbi Eliezer, defends him from the townspeople, tells the townspeople, he is my guest, he's coming to my home, please do not say anything negative to him. And he invites him over to his house, and he brings him in, and he takes care of him, takes good care of him, and he doesn't mention anything about the fact that he had come desecrating the Shabbat. And he spends an entire Shabbat with him. After Shabbat is over, he gives him food for his journey, and he accompanies him to the end of town. And as he's saying goodbye, this man says, I want you to know that I am Eliyahu Hanavi. I am Elijah. And I was sent here. You were supposed to be given a very great gift. But you first needed to face a test. I was sent here to test you, to see what you would do if I would come desecrating the Shabbat, and how you would respond to it. And because you invited me in with open arms, without asking any questions, without berating me, without telling me, without even saying anything about my Shabbat desecration, because of that, you have excelled in the mitzvah of Hachnasat Orchim, of hospitality, and because of that, you will merit to have a child who will become a great Jewish leader, and they indeed merit, they have a son not long after, whom they name Yisrael, who grows up to be Reb Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. Any questions? So we today must continue this very, very long Jewish tradition of Jewish hospitality. However, today, a couple things have changed. Now, this law, we Jews throughout history have always been hospitable, invited people into their homes, offer them things to eat, places to stay. It also includes inviting our home for general company. Maimonides says that this is the law that Abraham enacted, Hachok shechakak Abraham, and this is his way of kindness. And we Jews must follow in his footsteps as his descendants to always bring in guests. Now, historically, Jews lived in towns, in villages. There were always travelers. Bringing in guests generally meant bringing in guests who were travelers. As I mentioned earlier, one was unable to go in advance and book an itinerary of all the different hotels you would stay in on your travels. There was no phone system. There was certainly no internet, right? There were no travel agents that could book itineraries for you. A person came to town, they had to then find a place to stay. So hospitality was very, very important because, well, of course, there were for-pay hospitality, hotels, inns, that existed everywhere. Jews have always been in the hospitality business, but hospitality as a favor was always very important because there were places where it was not financially viable to have a hospitality business, small towns. And so when guests did come, they would be invited by the local townspeople. And there were many travelers who were very poor and simply did not have the money to pay for their needs. And they would often travel penniless. They didn't have any money, sometimes for business reasons, sometimes looking for a job. They would travel. They didn't have money to pay for hospitality, for food or lodging. And so the communities, therefore, were generous and would invite these people in. Jews, individuals were generous and invite these people in both as individuals as well as a community. Times, however, have greatly changed in many different ways. Firstly, as we know, virtually wherever a person lives, there is a hotel not too far away. So anyone who can afford it is able to easily find a hotel. Not only that, before you go anywhere, you can go on the internet and you can easily book a hotel in the place that you are planning to stay. Now, some places, if you're kosher, some places might have kosher food. Some places may not have kosher food. You may have trouble getting kosher food. You may need help from locals with food. But a place to stay today is easy to find. Furthermore, today we live in a time with a fairly strong social safety net. It's imperfect, but we have a fairly strong social safety net. And that means that while 100 years ago, or even less, some of us have heard from our parents, grandparents about the Great Depression. There were times less than 100 years ago, even in this country, when people were literally starving. They had no food to eat. They had no place to stay, right? There were times when people, were lived on the generosity of other people around them. Today, we thankfully live in a society with a fairly strong, if imperfect, but fairly strong social safety net. That means that by and large, people in this country can get their basic needs met by society, whether some provided by the government, some by private organizations, both places to live, food to eat, basic money to live on. There are programs, government programs, private programs that really take care of most of these things today. It's very rare for people to be starving today. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who don't have roofs over their heads, particularly in this city, people whose basic needs are not met. Unfortunately, it is most of the time due to other factors other than just they simply are out of luck and were not able to find jobs, were not able to get enough income to be able to buy food for that day. Unfortunately, there are other factors, sometimes beyond their control, mental health, sometimes within, was at one point in their control, but maybe no longer, maybe drugs. And there are other reasons why people often get, or sometimes it's a choice of a lifestyle people have, but there are other reasons, unfortunately, today, why people are struggling and don't have their basic needs met. And we have to do things to try to help those people as well, but that's somewhat of a separate topic, and that really is its own topic. So the need to give charity, to care for people's basic needs today is no longer applicable the way it was 100 years ago. And often charity that you're going to give, perhaps to somebody who is homeless, is going to be used for the wrong reasons. One has to be very careful how they give charity. Once upon a time, most people who were poor and simply begging for food, simply they were out of luck. They did not find a job that day. They did not find money that day, and they simply did not. We can't imagine it because we haven't lived that kind of life, but people did, and there's a lot of parts of the world where people still live like that today. They simply were not able to get a job that day, weren't able to find work that day. They don't have money to feed themselves. And so today we don't have that as much anymore. So today we still need to be hospitable, but that basic hospitality of caring for passerbyers is no longer as important as it was in earlier generations. And yet, hospitality is still very important.
It's also dangerous.
It's still very important. It's important. Hospitality is still very important. It's important for Jews who can usually find themselves a place to stay, but sometimes cannot find themselves a place to eat in a place where kosher food is not readily available. We could invite them in. It's important for Jews who want a Shabbat dinner, or who are in a place Shabbat and need a place to eat Shabbat. They could buy food themselves, kosher food, and eat themselves, but that would be difficult and not in a Shabbat spirit to eat in their hotel room on Shabbat. So we can still offer, and many communities still offer hospitality as well. Now, the hospitality to those that are truly in need today, as I mentioned, often for factors other than just out of luck. Most of the time due to factors out of luck. It's usually, as Helene pointed out, it's not a good idea to just invite them into your home because those other factors can end up causing harm. We're often better working with organizations, professionals that can help these people with their particular needs, whatever they might be, through various, and we have thankfully organizations in this city that are able to help people in a positive way. So it's important to remember that. even when we do invite in guests to our home today, and we should have an open home and be prepared to invite in guests, it is important. The Talmud tells us that when dealing with strangers, we should always respect but suspect. It's always important to be careful. It's always important to remember that until you know someone is vouched for and you can trust them, not to trust them. And so you can, if you feel safe, because you're in a situation where even if they're not fully safe, you think you can handle it, by all means invite them. Otherwise, and many communities do this, today it's very easy to ask for references for someone you don't know. You can ask them, which Jewish community do you go to? Which rabbi do you know? And get references. And that's widely done. When most communities, before they invite in strangers today, will ask for references, which, ask for a rabbi that you can serve as a reference for them, in order to ensure that they are safe. And yet, though the mitzvah in its simplest form of allowing passerbyers, people passing through town, to come into your home and giving them a bed and a hot meal is no longer relevant in the same way, we still can fulfill the mitzvah of hospitality by helping those that do pass through and need maybe a Shabbat meal or the like. We also can fulfill the mitzvah of hospitality simply by inviting those around us, people around us, friends, neighbors, people in our community, invite them over for dinner. Take care of them in that sense. Many people today are struggling with emotional health. In a sense, our society today, on the one hand, is materially very, very wealthy. And despite everybody complaining, we are wealthier than any society ever in history. Yet are materially wealthy. Yet we have spiritual and mental, emotional poverty. We are less mentally stable than any society before us. And a big part of that lack of mental stability is due to a lack of community, due to a lack of social network, due to a lack of friendship. We're more lonely than we ever were before. And as a result, people are struggling emotionally more than ever before. In fact, the troubles of those who today are homeless, which, as we pointed out, are largely, not always, but largely due to other factors, mental health, drugs, other factors that are involved. Those other factors are largely exasperated and often triggered as a result of the lack of social network. In other words, the reason why we have a bigger problem with this today, they didn't have a problem to the same extent generations ago, was when they had a strong social network, people with mental health problems didn't struggle in the same way. It didn't bother them as much. People didn't turn to drugs because they had a strong social network. So our best way to counter that is by enhancing and improving our own social network within our community. And so we can today fulfill the mitzvah of hospitality by reaching out to people in our community, showing friendship, inviting them over, going out with them, inviting them. It doesn't have to even be inviting them to your home. You can invite them to come with you to shul, invite them to come with you to daven, to prayers, invite them to come with you to a event, to a Torah class. Invite people, and that way, while we don't as much anymore need hospitality to give people their basic physical needs, food and shelter, as much anymore, we still need hospitality in order to give each other emotional needs. And these are more needed than ever before. So it's important that we invite others whom we know and trust, but still are lonely. Invite them over to our homes, invite them over for Shabbat, invite them over if we're alone ourselves, and we're not comfortable perhaps inviting people over, that's fine. Invite them to come to shul with you. Invite them to go out with you, to go shopping with you even. Invite them to become part of the community. We can experience hospitality and fulfill the mitzvah of hospitality in that same way as well. Just want to conclude with a story that my grandfather used to tell. about that he had heard from, I forget who it was, but a certain fundraiser who used to go around raising money. And this was back in the 1950s, many, many years ago. And he heard that in a certain town, there was a fellow by the name of Abe who was very, very wealthy. And any fundraiser for a Jewish cause who would go to visit him would get $100 on the spot. $100 then in the 1950s was, I think it's about 20 times what it was 70 years ago. So it was a lot of money. So he decided to go. He goes and he visits this fellow. This fellow is very, very happy to see him. He invites him into his office, and they talk for a while. And he notices that whenever, as they're talking, this person's phone is ringing off the hook. They're ringing all the time. He keeps excusing himself to answer phone calls, and some of them are about his various businesses. But many of them are different organizations calling him, asking for money. And each one that calls and asks for money, he allows them to, he generously pledges various amounts. Seems to be very, very generous. And so he says, so then he tells the rabbi, while you are here, since you're here anyway, I don't get a lot of Jewish visitors in this town. Why don't you come with me? I will show you my restaurant chain. He had a chain of restaurants in town, not kosher restaurants. So he brings him to one of his restaurants. He shows him the rabbi's there already. He's giving him money. He's not going to say no. So he goes with him to one of his restaurants, and they come into the restaurant. As they come in, there's a big commotion going on. And so Abe walks over to see what happens, and one of the people turned to him, and Abe turns to one of the people and says, "What's going on?" And he says, "Well, this man over here, he's homeless. And he came to the restaurant and he wants a free meal." And so Abe responds and he says, "Well, don't we have a deal that any person who walks in and asks for a free meal gets a free meal?" And he said, "Yes, but the problem is that this man smells. And if he comes in, all the paying customers are going to leave." And so Abe says, "Well, the rule is a rule. The rule is that anyone who asks for a free meal gets a free meal. There's no exceptions for people that smell. He gets to come in as well." And then he turns to the homeless fellow and he asks him, "How did you get here?" And he says, "Well, I jumped on top of a freight train in order to get from town to town. I couldn't pay for a ticket. And over there on top of the train, I met another homeless fellow also traveling to town. And he told me that if I get off at the station in this town and I go to one of these restaurants, I get a guaranteed free meal. And here I came, and the manager won't give me a free meal. And so I'm insisting. I know I'm supposed to get a free meal. I'm insisting on my free meal." And so he turns to the manager. He says, "Please let him in. Give him a free meal. Those are the rules in this restaurant." So the rabbi turns to Abe and he says, "I'm really impressed by your generosity. Very, very impressive. But what made you be so generous?" So Abe says, "Let me tell you, when I was a child in Europe, I went to Cheder. And over there in Cheder, I don't remember much because I left Cheder as a very young child. I was forced to go to work. But I only remember one thing from Cheder. We were learning about Abraham. And we were learning about how Abraham had doors on all four sides of his tent. And so my teacher turned to me and he said, 'My name is also Avraham.' He said, 'So Avraham, are you going to have doors on all four sides of your home like your ancestor Abraham?' And I said, 'Absolutely, I will have doors on all four sides of my home.' And that's all I remember from my schooling. Not long afterwards, as a young man, I came to America, penniless, to try my fortune, and I ended up in this town. I did very, very well for myself. But I never forgot my promise to my teacher that I would be like Abraham. I will have doors on all sides of my home. It wasn't practical in the United States to literally have doors on all four sides, but to be generous and allow anyone to come in and get a free meal and allow anyone in need and help anyone who is in need." So we are able to continue this chok shechakak Avraham, this law that Abraham had made, this tradition of Jewish hospitality, although society has changed and perhaps we don't fulfill it in the same way, but by being generous, by caring for others in need, by inviting others over, looking out for others, and remember especially that our poverty today is emotional, spiritual poverty, and that is why people are suffering, and we can help counter that by reaching out to others and help caring for others. Oh, yes.
Okay, so I want to ask you a question. So when I lived in the valley and I used to go to the Chabad shul, the rabbi at the end of the service would ask anybody if they didn't have anywhere to go for Shabbos, and he would make sure that the people who didn't have anywhere to go would find them somewhere to go. Why does this not happen in this shul?
Who says it doesn't happen?
No, but the rabbi never
Friday
said,
night?
has anyone got somewhere to go for Sukkot? Has anyone got somewhere to go for Passover?